Get your hands off my son's future and get out of my house before I have you removed like the gold-digging nobody you are." My mother-in-law's voice hit the microphone so hard the speakers screeched, and 200 people in tuxedos and sequined gowns turned their champagne flutes toward me at exactly the same second. I was standing under a chandelier that probably cost more than my father's entire house, wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought on clearance, and I felt every single eye in that ballroom crawl over my skin like I was something that had wandered in off the street. Somewhere behind me, a string quartet kept playing for 3 more seconds before someone finally told them to stop. My husband's hand, which had been resting on the small of my back 30 seconds earlier, was gone. I didn't turn to look for it. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray of oysters tilting dangerously in his hand. My daughter's photograph was still glowing on the giant screen behind the stage, part of the slideshow honoring the sacrifices of military families that Eleanor Whitfield Cross had spent 4 months planning and $40,000 funding, and now she was standing directly beneath that photograph, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me, telling an entire ballroom of donors, journalists, and business partners that I was a fraud who had never held a real job in her life and was circling her son's inheritance like a vulture that had learned to wear lipstick. I let the silence stretch. In my line of work, silence is not weakness. Silence is data collection. I watched her chest heave, watched the vein pulse in her forehead beneath $400 of foundation, watched her eyes dart toward the cameras from the local news station she herself had invited, because Eleanor Whitfield Cross never did anything without an audience. And then I watched something she hadn't planned for walk through the ballroom doors. A man in dress blues, silver eagles on his shoulders, moved through the crowd with a kind of unhurried, deliberate pace that makes rooms go quiet before people even understand why. He walked past the mayor. He walked past the hospital board chairman. He walked past Eleanor's own attorney, who had been sharpening his tongue all evening in preparation for exactly this moment. He stopped 6 feet from me, came to attention, and rendered a slow, formal salute in front of every single person my mother-in-law had spent a small fortune inviting to watch her destroy me. "Special Agent Whitfield Cross," he said, loud enough that the microphone Eleanor was still gripping, picked it up and threw the words across the entire room. "Colonel Harmon, sir. It's an honor." The oysters hit the floor. I heard the tray clatter somewhere off to my left, but I didn't look. I kept my eyes on my mother-in-law's face as it drained from a furious, triumphant red into something closer to the color of the tablecloths. Her mouth was still open. No sound was coming out of it anymore. Behind her, my husband's father set down his scotch very slowly, the way people set things down when their hands have started shaking and they don't want anyone to notice. And somewhere in my chest, underneath 18 months of silence, underneath every dinner where I'd been introduced as my son's little decorator wife, underneath every single time she had looked at me like something she'd scraped off the bottom of a very expensive shoe, a very small, very cold part of me thought, there it is. But to understand exactly what Colonel Harmon was doing at that gala, and why the woman screaming into that microphone was about to have the worst night of her privileged life, you need to understand what happened 2 years earlier, on the night I got married into a family that had already decided, before I ever said I do, that I was never going to be enough. I met my husband, Daniel, at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning when I was 26 years old, and working 2 jobs to pay off the last of my student loans, and he was the kind of easy, unguarded kind that made you forget, for a few hours, that the world had ever taught you to keep your defenses up. He didn't ask what my father did for a living. He didn't ask which country club my family belonged to, because we didn't belong to one, and he didn't seem to care that I'd grown up in a 2-bedroom house where my dad fixed transmissions in the garage until his knuckles were permanently scarred. He just laughed at my jokes and remembered, 3 dates later, that I took my coffee black because my stomach couldn't handle cream. I should have known something was wrong the first time I met his mother, because Eleanor Whitfield Cross looked at my hands before she looked at my face. She was searching for a ring, I understood later, calculating in real time whether I was a threat worth eliminating early or a phase her son would grow out of on his own. She decided, apparently, that I was a phase. She was wrong for 2 years, and she never forgave me for it. The wedding itself was small, because Daniel and I paid for most of it ourselves, and Eleanor made sure everyone in her social circle understood exactly why. At the reception, in front of Daniel's aunts and his father's business partners, she lifted my father's wedding gift off the gift table, a plain silver wristwatch he'd saved for months to buy me, the crystal already faintly scratched because he'd worn it himself for years before deciding I should have it. And she held it up between two fingers, like she'd found something unpleasant stuck to her shoe. "How thoughtful," she said, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. I didn't realize pawnshops did gift wrapping now. A few people laughed. The nervous kind of laugh people give when they don't want to be the one who doesn't. My father, standing 12 feet away, heard every word. He didn't say anything. He just picked up his drink and walked toward the bar, and I watched the back of his neck turn red the way it used to when a customer accused him of overcharging for an honest repair. I found him 20 minutes later sitting alone at the edge of the parking lot, staring at nothing. "You don't have to wear it if it embarrasses you," he said, not looking at me. I picked up his hand, the same scarred, permanently oil-stained hand that had taught me how to check my own tire pressure and change my own brake pads because he refused to raise a daughter who needed a man to survive. And I put the watch back on my wrist myself. "I'm never taking it off," I told him. I meant it as comfort. I didn't know yet that it would become something closer to a weapon. Eleanor smiled at me across the room for the rest of the night like she'd won something. And in her mind, she had. She had established, on my wedding day, exactly where I stood in her family's hierarchy, and for the first 18 months of my marriage, I let her believe I'd accepted it. What most people never understood about that night, including Daniel for a long time, was that the watch comment wasn't the worst part. The worst part came an hour later, during the toasts, when Eleanor stood up with a glass of champagne, tapped it twice with a spoon until the room quieted, and delivered a speech about her son's bright future that never once mentioned my name. She talked about Daniel's education, his career trajectory, the family legacy he was destined to carry forward, and she thanked the wonderful people who have shaped him into the man he is today. A list that somehow included his prep school headmaster, his childhood tennis coach, and a family friend who'd once helped him get an internship, but not me. Not the woman he had just legally bound his life to 20 minutes earlier. I sat at the head table in my rented chair, smiling the way you smile when 300 people are watching to see if you'll crack, and I felt my father's hand find mine under the tablecloth, steady and rough and warm, the same hand that had spent 30 years absorbing customers who assumed a man in a stained work shirt couldn't be trusted with an honest estimate. He didn't say anything either. He just held on, the way he always did, and I understood, even then, on the happiest day of my adult life, that I had married into a family that had already decided how small they intended to make me, and that no amount of love from their son was going to change that calculation on its own. The campaign, because that's what it was, started small and precise, the way real damage always does. It wasn't screaming. Eleanor Whitfield Cross was far too controlled for screaming, at least in the beginning. It was a comment at every family dinner about how I must be so relieved not to have real career pressure like Daniel did. It was introducing me to her friends as Daniel's wife. She does something with paperwork, I think, even after I told her 3 separate times exactly what I did for a living. It was the Christmas. She gave Daniel a set of cufflinks worth more than my monthly salary and handed me a gift card to a discount clothing store, because I noticed you tend to shop there. Each individual moment was small enough to swallow, small enough that if I'd said something, I would have looked oversensitive, dramatic, ungrateful for being welcomed into a family with money. That was the design. Eleanor never left fingerprints large enough to be called out directly. She built her cruelty out of 1,000 paper cuts, each one too small to bleed from alone. 6 months after the wedding, on a Friday evening, I remember specifically because it was the day my supervisor had told me I was being considered for a specialized assignment I'd wanted for 2 years, Eleanor sat across from me at a family dinner, cut her chicken into precise, unhurried pieces, and said, without looking up, "You know, Daniel's grandmother never worked a single day after she married into this family. It simply wasn't necessary. I think it would do wonders for your marriage if you stopped playing office and focused on being a wife." Daniel, sitting beside me, said nothing. He never said anything. Not because he agreed with her, he told me later, but because 29 years of being her son had taught him that disagreeing with Eleanor out loud only made things worse for everyone downstream of the disagreement, and I was always the one downstream. I smiled, said something non-committal about enjoying my work, and went home that night and lay awake staring at the ceiling, doing math I hadn't wanted to do yet. I didn't argue with her. I didn't confront her. 2 weeks later, without telling a single member of my husband's family, I signed paperwork that would change the entire shape of my life, and I didn't tell them, because some decisions you make for yourself, quietly, are the only ones nobody else gets to take away from you. What I signed was an application to become a special agent with the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division, a job that required a security clearance so deep that even my own husband would eventually learn to stop asking follow-up questions about my boring compliance work, because he understood, without me spelling it out, that some silences existed to protect people, not to punish them. The selection process took months. The training that followed took longer, and it broke me down in ways Eleanor's dinner table comments never could, because the instructors at the academy didn't care what my last name was or which country club I couldn't afford. They cared whether I could read a crime scene the way most people read a room, whether I could sit across from someone lying to my face and let the silence do the work instead of my temper. During the interrogation phase of training, I froze during a mock scenario, completely locked up in front of my entire cohort, the same way I used to freeze at Eleanor's dinner table, waiting to be told I wasn't enough. A fellow trainee named Priya, a former paralegal from Houston who'd washed out of 2 other career tracks before finding this one, pulled me aside afterward instead of letting me spiral alone in the barracks. "You keep waiting for permission to take up space," she told me, blunt in a way nobody in Daniel's family had ever bothered to be with me. "Nobody's going to hand that to you. You have to just start taking it." She ran interrogation drills with me every night for 3 weeks after regular training hours, refusing to let me apologize my way through a single sentence, until the freezing stopped and something colder and steadier took its place. She didn't do it because she owed me anything. She did it because that's what people who actually see you do, and it was the first time in 2 years that anyone had invested in me without expecting something back. One night, deep into the 3rd week, Priya stopped the drill halfway through and asked me a question that had nothing to do with the mock scenario in front of us. "Who taught you to apologize before anyone even accuses you of anything?" I didn't have an answer ready, and she didn't wait for one. "Somebody trained that into you," she said, "probably before you were old enough to know it was happening. My job right now isn't to teach you interrogation technique. You already have the instincts. My job is to untrain whatever taught you to shrink first and ask questions later." I thought about Eleanor's dinner table more in that barracks room than I ever admitted out loud, about the specific way she could make a room feel like it was waiting for me to justify my own existence before I'd said a single word. Priya never asked for details. She just kept running the drills, kept forcing me to hold eye contact 3 seconds longer than felt comfortable, kept making me repeat statements without softening them with qualifiers, until holding my ground stopped feeling like an act of defiance and started feeling like something closer to my actual personality. By the time I graduated, I could sit across from someone twice my rank, lying to my face with complete confidence, and simply wait, unbothered, until the silence did what pressure never could. It is a strange, specific kind of gift. Learning that skill from a stranger in a barracks room 3 weeks before you ever needed to use it on your own mother-in-law. When I graduated and earned my badge, my mother-in-law was told, along with everyone else, that I'd taken a government position, something administrative. Daniel let her believe it, because I asked him to, and because he understood, finally, what she would do with the truth if she had it early. The first case I was assigned that mattered, 3 years into the job, involved a defense contractor skimming funds from a veterans housing initiative, and I remember sitting in the surveillance van at 2 in the morning thinking about how strange it was that the discipline it took to sit still for 6 hours straight, watching a warehouse door that never opened, was the exact same discipline it took to sit at Eleanor's dinner table and let her insults slide off a face I'd trained myself not to react with. The job taught me patience as a weapon rather than a virtue. It taught me that the people who talk the loudest, who need everyone in the room to agree with them immediately, are almost always compensating for something they're desperate to keep hidden, and Eleanor Whitfield Cross talked louder than anyone I had ever met. The second wave of her campaign started the year our daughter, Sophie, was born, and it was crueler because now she had a new lever to pull, and Eleanor Whitfield Cross never met a lever she didn't pull as hard as physically possible. She started showing up unannounced during the day, checking on the baby, which really meant standing in my kitchen, critiquing how I folded onesies or heated formula, always careful to phrase it as concern rather than attack, always careful to make Daniel feel, when he came home, like his mother was simply a devoted grandmother, rather than a woman conducting a slow, methodical audit of my fitness as a parent. 6 weeks after Sophie was born, I was called in for a 2-week deployment assignment that couldn't be discussed, couldn't be explained, and couldn't be delayed. The kind of assignment that exists specifically because someone has to be willing to disappear without a satisfying explanation. I told Daniel I'd be traveling for work. I told Eleanor nothing, because Eleanor had never earned the right to know anything true about my life. On the 9th day I was gone, Sophie spiked a fever of 104 in the middle of the night, and by the time Daniel got her to the emergency room, she was being admitted for a severe respiratory infection that would keep her hospitalized for 4 days. I was in a secure facility 1,100 miles away with my phone locked in a container I couldn't access, and by the time I got the message and made it home, my daughter had already been discharged, pale and exhausted, clutching a stuffed rabbit the hospital had given her. Eleanor was waiting in my living room when I walked through the door. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask where I'd been. She stood up from my own couch, arms crossed over an ivory cardigan, and said, "While you were off doing whatever it is you actually do." I had to watch my granddaughter struggle to breathe because her mother couldn't be bothered to answer her phone. I've spoken to my attorney about what protections exist for a child whose mother clearly can't be trusted to show up when it matters. I stood in my own doorway, still in the clothes I'd been wearing for 31 hours, and felt something in my chest go very, very quiet. The specific quiet that comes right before a decision gets made. Daniel tried to explain, weakly, that I'd been traveling for work and hadn't been reachable, and Eleanor waved him off like he was an inconvenience interrupting her performance. "I'm simply saying," she said, looking directly at me, "that a real mother finds a way to be reachable, unless there's something you're not telling us about what you actually do all day." I said nothing. I walked past her, into Sophie's room, and sat on the floor beside her crib, until the sun came up, and somewhere in those silent hours, I stopped feeling guilty about the secrets I was keeping, and started feeling something closer to certainty, that they were the only thing keeping my family standing at all. 2 weeks later, at a family dinner I almost didn't attend, Eleanor brought it up again, this time in front of Daniel's aunt and uncle, framing it as a light-hearted family anecdote, instead of the accusation it actually was. "Can you imagine," she said, "cutting into a piece of salmon, being so consumed by your little job that your own daughter ends up in the hospital and you can't even be found? I don't know how some women live with that kind of guilt." Daniel's aunt made a sympathetic noise. Daniel's uncle studied his plate very intently. I sat there with Sophie asleep against my shoulder, feeling the specific, precise heat of an insult delivered as concern, and I did the math again, the same math I'd been doing for 2 years. If I defended myself, I would have to explain classified work I legally could not explain, and Eleanor would spend the rest of the meal implying that my silence was proof of guilt rather than proof of clearance. If I said nothing, she would repeat the story at every future gathering, sanding it down each time into something crueler, until it hardened into the official family record of who I was. I chose silence, not because I had no defense, but because I had learned, by then, that the only defense that would ever actually work was the one I was already quietly building. 1,100 miles and several security clearances away from that dinner table, and Eleanor Whitfield Cross had no idea it existed. 3 weeks after that night, going through a box of documents Daniel had asked me to help him sort for his father's small business partnership, I found something that had nothing to do with Daniel's father at all. Tucked inside a folder labeled with the name of the charitable foundation Eleanor had founded 4 years earlier, the Whitfield Cross Family Fund for Veteran Support, was a set of financial disclosures that didn't match the glossy annual reports the foundation mailed to its donors every December. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I went digging for revenge isn't the true one. I was looking for tax documents for Daniel's father. What I found instead was a pattern, and patterns are the one thing 7 years of federal investigative training had taught me to see instinctively, the way some people see color or music. Administrative overhead that consumed nearly 60% of donations meant for disabled veterans and their families. Consulting fees paid to a company registered at Eleanor's own home address. Gala expenses that dwarfed the actual grant disbursements the foundation claimed to have made. I sat on my kitchen floor at 11 o'clock at night with those papers spread out around me and felt the particular, dizzying vertigo of realizing that the woman who had spent 3 years calling me a fraud, a gold digger, an unworthy addition to her family, was sitting on top of what looked, to my trained eye, like a textbook case of charitable fraud built entirely on the goodwill of donors who genuinely believed they were helping veterans like my own father would have been, If he'd served instead of spending his life under the hood of other people's cars. I didn't say anything to Daniel that night. I didn't say anything to anyone for 11 days, because the job had taught me the most dangerous thing you can do with a suspicion this large is act on it before you have proof, and proof takes patience most people don't have the stomach for. I made copies of everything before returning the folder exactly where I'd found it. I filed a preliminary report through channels that had nothing to do with my personal life, flagged for review by the appropriate division, because a case involving a registered nonprofit skimming veteran support funds wasn't technically my jurisdiction, but I knew people who could open the right doors, and I made sure, very deliberately, that my own name appeared nowhere near the initial paperwork. I wanted this investigated on its merits, not dismissed later as a daughter-in-law's grudge. For the next 14 months, while Eleanor continued introducing me at family gatherings as the one who does something with computers, I honestly forget, while she continued sending Sophie designer dresses and sending me discount coupons, while she continued hosting luncheons where she'd casually mention how some women just aren't built for career and family both, a team of federal financial investigators I had no official connection to was quietly building a case against her foundation, pulling bank records, interviewing former board members who'd resigned under mysterious circumstances, subpoenaing the consulting company registered at her home address. I found out about developments the same way anyone with the right clearance and the right patience finds things out, carefully, through channels, never once inserting myself directly into a case that legally had to remain untouched by my personal relationship to its target. It was the hardest professional discipline I have ever exercised in my life, sitting across from Eleanor at Thanksgiving dinner, watching her carve a turkey with the same hands that had spent years signing off on fraudulent disbursement reports, and saying absolutely nothing, passing the cranberry sauce, asking Daniel's father polite questions about his golf game. There was a night, about 8 months into the investigation, when the temptation to end it early nearly won. Eleanor had spent an entire dinner party describing me to a table of her friends as a lovely girl, really, just not built for the kind of ambition our family tends to have, and I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub with my phone in my hand. One authorized call away from requesting an expedited timeline on the case, just to make the humiliation stop sooner. I didn't make the call. I thought about my father instead, about the time a customer had accused him, loudly, in front of a full waiting room, of intentionally sabotaging a transmission to charge for a second repair, and how he had simply pulled the security camera footage, set it in front of the man without a word, and let the footage do what his own defense never could have accomplished as convincingly. He didn't argue his integrity. He proved it, once, with evidence so complete the accusation couldn't survive contact with it. I put my phone back in my pocket, splashed water on my face, and went back out to the dinner table. And I understood, sitting back down across from Eleanor's satisfied smile, that rushing the case to relieve my own discomfort would have handed her exactly the unfinished, arguable version of the truth she needed to survive it. I owed the real veterans whose money she'd taken more patience than that, even if it cost me more than I wanted to admit at the time. The reason I never simply told her, never simply produced my credentials at that Thanksgiving table and watched her face collapse in real time, is the same reason patient investigators let a suspect keep talking long after they've heard enough to make an arrest. If I revealed anything early, Eleanor's attorneys, and she employed several, would have had months to shred documents, move funds, coach witnesses, and construct a narrative where she was the victim of a jealous, resentful daughter-in-law abusing government access for a personal vendetta. She would have survived it. Worse, she would have thrived on it, turning herself into a martyr at every country club luncheon for the rest of her natural life. The only way to guarantee she couldn't talk her way out of what she'd built was to let the case mature entirely on its own evidence, entirely without me, until it was airtight enough that no lawyer on earth could spin it into anything but exactly what it was. So I waited. I went to birthday parties. I sat through insults about my job, my parenting, my father's profession, my clearance-mandated absences, and I let every single comment slide off a surface I had spent years training myself to keep perfectly, unreadably calm. Daniel started noticing the toll it was taking, the nights I'd stare at the ceiling instead of sleeping. And he asked me once, quietly, why I never fought back the way he half expected me to, because the fight isn't happening yet? I told him, which was the truest thing I could say without saying too much. He didn't understand. He trusted me anyway, which is its own kind of quiet loyalty I've never stopped being grateful for. The gala had been on Eleanor's calendar for 8 months before that night. An elaborate fundraiser to celebrate the 5th anniversary of her foundation's work supporting military families, complete with a keynote address, a silent auction, and a slideshow of photographs, including several of Sophie, that Eleanor had requested without asking me first, using my own daughter's image to raise money for a fraud I already knew, with near total certainty, was about to be shut down by federal investigators any week. I found out 3 days before the event, through the same careful channels I'd used for over a year, that the case had reached its final stage, that an arrest warrant had been approved, and that the operation to execute it had been scheduled to coincide, deliberately, with a public event where Eleanor would be surrounded by donors, press, and the exact community whose trust she had spent years manufacturing and exploiting. I want to be clear that I did not orchestrate the timing. That decision belonged entirely to the investigative team running the case, who understood, the way I did, that public fraud built on public reputation collapses most decisively in public view, in front of the same audience that had been deceived into funding it. I was simply told, through a phone call I took standing in my own garage so Daniel wouldn't overhear, that Colonel Harmon, the officer overseeing the final phase of the operation, would be attending the gala under the guise of an invited guest, that Eleanor herself had unknowingly placed him on her donor list months earlier, while trying to court military credibility for her fundraiser, and that when the moment came, he would be the one to formally identify me and initiate the arrest. I hung up the phone and stood in my garage for a long time, looking at nothing, feeling the particular kind of stillness that settles over you right before something you've waited years for finally arrives. I almost didn't go. I told Daniel I had a headache. I told myself I could let the case unfold without me standing in that room to watch it happen. But somewhere underneath 18 months of silence, underneath a wristwatch with a scratched crystal that I had never once taken off, underneath every single dinner where I'd swallowed an insult for the sake of a marriage and a daughter I loved more than my own pride, there was a version of myself who needed to be standing in that ballroom when it happened, not for revenge, but for the simple, human need to finally be seen accurately by the people who had spent years insisting on seeing me wrong. So I put on the navy blue dress I'd bought on clearance. I put on the watch, and I walked into that gala already knowing, with a certainty that made my hands perfectly steady, exactly how the night was going to end, though I had absolutely no idea Eleanor would hand me the opening herself, mid-sentence, in front of 200 witnesses and a local news crew, by deciding that this particular night, of all nights, was the one she'd finally stop restraining herself in public. She had been building toward it for the entire cocktail hour, I realized later, replaying the evening in my mind, the way I'd been trained to replay a scene for details I might have missed the first time. She'd made 3 separate comments to donors within earshot of me about how some family members simply prioritize differently, gesturing vaguely in my direction each time like I was a case study in a lecture on disappointing relatives. She'd introduced me to a business partner of Daniel's father as my son's wife. She has some sort of government desk job. Don't ask me what. And laughed lightly, like it was a joke we were both supposed to find charming. I smiled and said nothing. The same practice, nothing. I'd perfected over years of dinners exactly like this one, and I watched her mistake my composure for defeat, the way she always did, because Eleanor Whitfield Cross had never once, in 3 years, considered the possibility that my silence was a choice rather than a limitation. When the keynote portion of the evening began, she took the microphone herself, instead of handing it to the MC she'd hired, because Eleanor never missed an opportunity to be the center of a room she'd paid for, and she began a speech about sacrifice, about the families of service members who give up so much so quietly, about how her foundation existed to honor exactly that kind of an invisible strength. I stood near the back of the room with a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, and I watched 200 people nod along, genuinely moved, genuinely believing every word, and something in my chest tightened, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of grief for all the real veterans and real families whose trust had been turned into her personal currency. It was a reporter, of all people, a young woman from the local news station Eleanor had personally invited to cover the event for maximum visibility, who asked the question that lit the fuse. During the brief press availability Eleanor had scheduled for herself before the auction began, the reporter, doing basic due diligence, asked whether it was true that Eleanor's own daughter-in-law worked in some capacity connected to military or veteran affairs, since photographs of the whole military family had been featured prominently in the Foundation's promotional materials all evening. It was an innocent question. It should have been an easy one to deflect. But something about being asked to publicly account for me, in front of donors and cameras, on a night that was supposed to be entirely about her own generosity, seemed to detonate something Eleanor had been holding just barely in check for years. "She's not military," Eleanor said, loud enough that heads at nearby tables turned. "She works some sort of clerical job. We've never gotten a straight answer, frankly. I think it's best you don't repeat rumors about my family that aren't confirmed." The reporter, sensing a story where there hadn't been one a moment ago, pressed gently, asking whether there was some reason the details of my employment were unclear even to close family. And Eleanor, who had spent 3 years constructing a narrative in which I was beneath her son, beneath her family, beneath the life she believed she'd built through sheer force of taste and money, finally let the mask slip entirely in front of the one audience she could never afford to lose. She grabbed the microphone from the stand, walked to the edge of the small stage, and pointed directly at me across the crowded ballroom floor. "Get your hands off my son's future, and get out of my house before I have you removed like the gold-digging nobody you are," she said. And the words landed exactly as loud and exactly as public as she'd apparently, finally, wanted them to. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stood perfectly still under that chandelier, while 200 strangers turned to look at me like I was something Eleanor had discovered crawling across her marble floor, and I let the silence stretch, because I had spent years learning that silence, held correctly, is the loudest thing in any room. I watched her chest heave with the effort of her own outburst. I watched her attorney, seated at the head table, go pale, sensing correctly that his client had just said something in front of press, and 200 witnesses that could never be walked back. I watched Daniel step forward, his mouth open, caught somewhere between defending me and managing his mother, the way he'd been caught his entire life. And then the ballroom doors opened, and Colonel Harmon walked in, and everything Eleanor Whitfield Cross believed about her own power in that room, in that city, in her own family, began to come apart in real time, one deliberate footstep at a time. He moved through the crowd the way people move when they've spent decades being the person a room reorganizes itself around without being asked to. He didn't rush. He didn't look at Eleanor at all, not yet. He walked directly toward me, stopped at a precise, formal distance, came to attention, and rendered a salute so crisp it seemed to physically cut through the noise of the room. "Special Agent Whitfield Cross," he said. And the microphone Eleanor was still gripping, forgotten in her hand, caught every syllable, and threw it to the back wall of the ballroom. "Colonel Harmon, sir. It's an honor to finally meet you in person." I returned the greeting with the same formality I would have used in any secure briefing room, my voice level, my hand steady, my eyes never once leaving Eleanor's face, because I had waited a very long time to watch her understand, in real time, exactly how wrong she had been about who I was. The oyster tray hit the floor somewhere to my left. I heard it, distantly, the way you hear something happening in another room. Eleanor's mouth was still open, the shape of her last sentence frozen there, but no sound was coming out of it anymore. Her face drained from a furious, triumphant red into something closer to the color of the linen tablecloths draped over every table in that ballroom she'd spent $40,000 decorating. "Special Agent," the reporter repeated, already turning her recorder toward us, sensing correctly that the actual story of the evening had just walked through the door. Colonel Harmon didn't wait for Eleanor to recover. He turned toward her with the same unhurried precision he'd used across the room, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried the particular weight of a man who has delivered difficult news to difficult people his entire career and has long since stopped softening it for anyone's comfort. "Mrs. Whitfield Cross, I'm going to need a few minutes of your time," he said. "I have federal agents outside who'd like to discuss the financial records of the Whitfield Cross Family Fund for Veteran Support, specifically regarding the disbursement of donor funds over the past 4 years." A silence fell over that ballroom unlike any I have ever experienced in my entire career, thick enough that I could hear the ice shifting in someone's drink 3 tables away. Eleanor's attorney was on his feet immediately, already reaching for damage control, but Colonel Harmon raised a single hand, and the man sat back down without another word. "Ma'am," Harmon continued, "you are not under arrest at this time, but I need to inform you that an investigation into potential fraud, embezzlement, and falsification of nonprofit financial disclosures has concluded, and a warrant has been issued for your arrest, effective this evening." He said the word arrest the way you say a word you've said 1,000 times before, with no theater in it at all, which somehow made it land harder than any amount of drama could have. Two men in plain suits I hadn't noticed, near the ballroom's side entrance, began moving toward the stage, unhurried, professional, the way people move when the outcome is already decided, and there's no reason to rush toward it. Eleanor's knees seemed to buckle slightly, though her hand found the podium in time to keep her upright. "This is absurd," she said, her voice climbing an octave, cracking at the edges. "This is a mistake. I have never... This is clearly some kind of... Someone is clearly trying to sabotage me. I want my attorney. I want..." She looked directly at me then. And for the first time in 3 years, I watched something other than contempt cross her face. I watched her search my expression for confirmation of a suspicion I could see forming behind her eyes in real time, the horrifying, dawning realization that the daughter-in-law she had spent years dismissing as a nobody with a clerical job had spent the last 14 months quietly walking the exact path that had led federal agents into her fundraiser on the fundraiser, single most public night of her year. "You," she said, her voice dropping to something almost like a whisper, though the microphone was still on, still catching every word, still broadcasting it to the back row. "You did this." I let her have exactly 3 seconds of silence before I answered, because some silences exist purely for the sake of restraint, and this one existed because I wanted her to sit inside that accusation long enough to understand it wasn't going to save her. "I didn't do anything except my job," I said, and I kept my voice level, the same flat, controlled register I'd used to brief supervisors on cases with far higher stakes than a country club fraud scheme. The evidence did the rest. It usually does, once someone stops being careful enough to hide it. The two agents reached the stage. One of them said something quiet to Eleanor that I couldn't hear over the murmur rising through the crowd, and I watched her shoulders drop, watched the fight visibly drain out of her as the reality of handcuffs, of a formal reading of rights, of a night that would end not in triumph but in a holding cell, finally settled into her body. Daniel appeared at my side then, his hand finding mine, his voice low and stunned. "You're a federal agent," he said. Not a question, more like a man rearranging every memory of the past 3 years into a shape that finally made sense. "You've been investigating my mother." I nodded once. "For 14 months, I told him. "I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry. I needed the case to be untouchable before it ever touched our family." He looked at his mother, being escorted, not yet in handcuffs but close enough to it that the distinction barely mattered, past tables of stunned donors who had, an hour earlier, been writing checks in her name. He looked back at me, and something in his face, something that had spent 3 years absorbing his mother's cruelty toward me without ever fully naming it, finally settled into something like clarity. "I should have said something," he said quietly. "Years ago, every dinner, every comment. I should have said something and I never did." I squeezed his hand once. "You're saying something now," I told him. And it was enough, for that moment, to be true. The reporter who had asked the original question was already filing a story on her phone, murmuring quietly into it as she watched agents guide Eleanor toward the ballroom side exit, past the slideshow still glowing behind the stage, past photographs of veterans who had trusted her with money meant to rebuild their lives, past a photograph of my own daughter that Eleanor had used, without permission, to make herself look like the kind of woman who deserved anyone's trust at all. Eleanor turned back once, near the doors, her makeup streaked, her posture broken in a way I had genuinely never seen from her in 3 years of dinners and holidays and carefully engineered humiliations. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she said, and there was something almost childlike in it. Some final, desperate reach for a version of events where this was somehow my failure rather than the direct, inevitable consequence of her own choices. "If I'd known who you really were..." None of this. She didn't finish the sentence. I don't think she knew how it was supposed to end. I looked at her from across that ballroom, at the woman who had held up my father's wedding gift like garbage in front of a room full of strangers, who had accused me of being an unfit mother while I was overseas doing work she would never be cleared to understand, who had spent 3 years deciding, without evidence, that I was beneath the family she'd built on money she had, it turned out, been quietly stealing from disabled veterans the entire time, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment, Not triumph. Not even relief. Exactly. Just a very clean, very final kind of clarity. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a person, I told her. That was never about clearance level. That was just you. She had nothing to say to that. The agents guided her the rest of the way out, and the ballroom doors closed behind her with a soft, expensive click, the kind of sound money makes even when it's failing spectacularly. The months that followed unwound with the quiet, mechanical inevitability of a case built correctly from the start. Eleanor was charged with wire fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, and falsification of federal tax documents, and the evidence, gathered patiently over more than a year by investigators who had never once needed my personal involvement to build an airtight case, left her attorneys with almost nothing to work with beyond a plea agreement designed to minimize a sentence that could otherwise have run into decades. The foundation was dissolved. Every remaining asset was seized, and, through a court-ordered restitution process, redirected toward the veterans' organizations, whose donors Eleanor had spent 4 years deceiving. The country club that had hosted 3 generations of Whitfield Cross membership quietly declined to renew hers, citing a vague administrative review that fooled absolutely no one. Former friends who had spent years laughing along at her comments about people like me, people without the right last names or the right country club memberships, stopped returning her calls entirely, the same way a narcissist's entire social architecture tends to collapse the moment it stops being profitable to maintain it. Daniel, for his part, spent the following weeks in a kind of quiet, exhausted grief. Not for the mother he'd known, exactly, but for the version of his childhood he'd spent 30 years defending without realizing how much of it had been built on the same currency she'd used to defraud strangers, appearance over substance, image over honesty. He didn't ask me to forgive her. I don't think he wanted me to. He asked me instead why I'd never once let him carry any of the weight of what I was building, and I told him the truth, that the discipline the job demanded of me, the ability to sit at his mother's dinner table for 3 years while quietly assembling a case against her, was the same discipline that had let me survive a childhood of my own, watching my father absorb insult after insult from customers who thought an honest mechanic in a small garage was somehow beneath them, and never once letting it change who he was underneath it. He asked me once, late at night, weeks after the arrest, whether I'd ever once considered telling him privately, letting him carry the secret alongside me, instead of discovering it in front of 200 strangers and a news camera. I told him the truth, that I had considered it more than once, and that every time I nearly did, I thought about how instinctively he still flinched around his mother, how 3 decades of managing her moods had trained him to soften bad news before it reached her, and I couldn't risk a single unguarded conversation undoing 14 months of work. He sat with that for a long time before he nodded, slowly, and said he understood, though I could tell some part of him was still working through what it meant that his wife had trusted a case file more than she'd trusted him, at least for a little while. It became, in the months that followed, one of the things we had to rebuild carefully, in small pieces, the same way you rebuild anything that's been under enough pressure to crack. He started asking questions instead of assuming answers. I started explaining what I legally could, instead of retreating into silence out of habit even when the silence was no longer necessary. Neither of us pretended it was simple. His mother's absence from every holiday that followed left a strange, hollow shape at the edges of family gatherings that none of us fully knew how to fill, and more than once I watched him stare at an empty chair at Thanksgiving with an expression I recognized, because I had worn it myself for years at that exact table. I learned patience from a man who fixed transmissions for a living and never raised his voice, and I learned precision from an agency that trained me to let evidence speak louder than anger ever could. And somewhere between those 2 educations, I became someone capable of sitting silently through 3 years of small, precise cruelty, waiting for the exact moment when the truth would do the work that confrontation never could. 6 months after the gala, I stood at a small ceremony in a community center 2 towns over, wearing my service uniform for the first time in front of my own daughter, who was old enough now to ask questions about the silver eagles and the ribbons and what they meant. And I watched a room full of veterans' families, the real ones, the ones Eleanor's foundation had promised to help and never actually reached, to receive the first disbursements from a new scholarship and emergency assistance fund I had established using a portion of the restitution the court had allocated toward genuine veteran support organizations. I named it after my father, the Walter Reyes Fund for Working Families, because he had spent his entire life proving that dignity has nothing to do with money, That a man who fixes transmissions for a living can raise a daughter who ends up sitting across interrogation tables from people far more powerful than the customers who once looked down on him. And that the quiet, unglamorous discipline of simply doing your job correctly, day after day, without needing anyone's approval to justify it, is its own kind of unshakable strength. Sophie was there, 3 years old, holding a small bouquet someone had handed her, utterly unaware that the woman being honored that day, her mother, had spent the last 18 months of her life absorbing insult after insult from a grandmother she would grow up barely remembering, precisely so that this room, full of families who actually needed help, could finally receive it. Daniel stood beside me the entire ceremony, his hand resting on my shoulder instead of the small of my back, and I understood, watching him watch our daughter, that whatever came next for our marriage, whatever it took to rebuild trust after 3 years of silence he hadn't understood the reason for, we were at least finally standing on the same side of something true. I still wear my father's watch every single day, the crystal more scratched now than it was on my wedding day, the second hand still ticking in that faint, imperfect rhythm it's always had, just slightly out of sync with everything around it. I've had opportunities to replace it, to have the crystal repaired, to make it look the way an expensive family like the Whitfield Crosses might expect a watch to look. I've never done it, and I don't think I ever will, because that small, imperfect, mistimed tick is the only sound in my life that has never once needed anyone else's permission to exist, exactly as it is. People ask me sometimes, colleagues mostly, people who've heard some version of the story secondhand, how I managed to sit through 3 years of quiet cruelty, without ever once losing my composure, without ever once giving Eleanor the satisfaction of watching me break. I tell them what my training taught me, and what my father taught me before any agency ever did. You don't spend your strength reacting to every insult thrown in your direction. You save it. You gather what you need. You wait for the moment when the truth, laid out carefully and completely, can do more damage in 30 seconds than 3 years of arguments ever could. And when that moment finally arrives, you don't raise your voice. You don't need to. You simply stand there, steady, and let the people who spent years underestimating you finally see, all at once, exactly who they were dealing with the entire time. There's a version of this story where I could tell you I felt nothing but triumph walking out of that community center ceremony, watching families receive checks that Eleanor's foundation had promised them and never delivered. But that wouldn't be entirely honest. What I actually felt, standing there in my uniform with Sophie's small hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers, was closer to exhaustion, the specific kind that only arrives once a threat you've been managing for years is finally, completely over. I hadn't realized how much of my daily energy had been quietly rerouted toward managing Eleanor, anticipating her comments, rehearsing my own composure before every family gathering, until all of that energy suddenly had nowhere left to go. I slept 11 hours the first night after her sentencing hearing concluded, the longest uninterrupted sleep I'd had in 3 years, and I woke up almost disoriented by how quiet my own mind had become. I think about my father often, these days, more than I did even in the months right after we lost him. I think about the fact that he never once got to see Sophie born, never got to watch me pin on the credentials that eventually forced Eleanor Whitfield Cross to finally answer for who she really was, and I think about how he would have handled that gala night if he'd been the one standing under that chandelier instead of me. He wouldn't have said much. He never did. He would have simply stood there, steady, letting the truth arrive on its own schedule, the same way he let an honest repair speak for itself. Instead of arguing with a customer who'd already decided not to believe him, I like to think some of that steadiness made it into me before he was gone. The same way his watch made it onto my wrist, imperfect and mistimed and entirely, permanently mine. I walked out of that ballroom that night holding my daughter's hand, my father's watch ticking its small, familiar, imperfect rhythm against my wrist. And I didn't look back once, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because there was finally, for the first time in 3 years, absolutely nothing behind me left worth turning around for. If you've ever sat quietly through someone underestimating you, waiting for the exact right moment to let the truth speak for itself, tell me about it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe, because there are a lot more moments like this one still to come.